I'm Mark Schmitt.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton.
And we're
Blogging Heads TV yet again.
That was great. That was
we're slick.
Yeah. I've never done a slick intro before. I always do a much more mild-mannered intro. So people are going to be looking forward to some real showmanship here. So let's see if we can give them a taste of an argument you and I had about immigration a few months ago.
Okay.
Which I usually kind of try to. I think the last time I did this, I got criticized in the comments because I sort of threw up my hands and said basically I don't do immigration, and I saw some of the comments said I was intellectually lazy and all that. And I thought, one has a right.
I don't think you're intellectually lazy, Mark, not at all. But I just remind you of what that great sage Philip K. Dick wrote, 30 years ago, which is that reality is that even when you get tired of it, it still sticks around.
I think I'm coming around to that view that I can't. I like to try to think. Okay, in the whole world of domestic policy issues, there can be one or two that I just actually choose not to know much about, because I do know a fair amount about a lot of stuff. But it's like housing policy and immigration. When I worked on the Hill, those were two things that I tried to just not deal with at all. But it often became impossible. To do that, I think it's impossible to ignore immigration. I was interested in a couple months ago you made the argument that you thought that the grassroots reaction against the immigration bill was comparable to the reaction around the Panama Canal treaties in the late 70s, and that it was one of those things that Washington misjudged, which I thought was really interesting because I think that late 70s. I'm very interested at the moment in that late 70s. Essentially what conservatives put together in the late 70s between the tax cuts and and then these grassroots movements like the reaction to the Panama Canal Treaty and defeating the ERA and putting all those pieces together. And I wonder if now that it's actually basically done, if you still think it has that power to energize people in a broader sense against Washington in a way that will be, and that who will benefit from that politically.
Right. The late 70s, of course, the 70s began with Richard Nixon being declared, a crook and being forced to resign, and the Republicans being clobbered in the 1974 midterm elections.
Right.
And yet, 4 years later, the Republicans were clearly on the resurgency again, and then 6 years later, of course, they won back the White House,
right.
and the Senate.
Right.
So, in other words, I think it shows exactly how important that period of, say, 1976 to 1979 was in terms of reshaping politics, right, in a way. And I guess the lesson there was that although Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and sort of Bob Michael, Everett Dirksen type republicanism had been clobbered, there was a new kind of Ronald Reagan, I have a better word, Newt Gingrich type conservatism on the ascendancy. That proved to be much more effective and much more potent and much more powerful. And I sort of think that the reason for that is because that's basically this is a center-right country, and whenever the center-right forces develop an articulate set of spokespersons, they win.
Right. Right. So who do you see emerging in that?
Well, so the issue now is, obviously George W. Bush has done a great deal to discredit the Republican Party and discredit himself and drive his own poll numbers down to as low as 26, according to some surveys. And, it's fair to say that sort of the neoconservative ideology of, has been repudiated by the voters, not to mention by reality. But the underlying nature of the American body politic, I think, is still conservative and nationalistic and flag-waving and pro-police and pro-military. And those are the people and those are the impulses that I think the Republicans have a chance to summon up. Especially if the Democrats won't do it. And I should say immediately that somebody like Jim Webb or John Tester, if they were running the Democratic Party, they might well capture this entire spirit of concern over issues like immigration and national sovereignty that are so bewildering to not only conservatives but also to sort of Reagan Democrat-ish type people, and yet Tester and Webb and Claire McCaskill in Missouri are nowhere in terms of the National Democratic Party, which is still thoroughly in the grip of the people behind Hillary and Obama. And so that's why the Republicans now, I think, have a huge opening and a huge opportunity that nobody would have seen even a few months ago.
Well, Tester and Webb and McCaskill, I mean, particularly Tester and Webb, are great heroes in the Democratic Party. They're nowhere only in the sense that they voted against the immigration bill.
No, they're nowhere in terms of not having any prospect of being on the national ticket.
Well, that's right, but they're freshman senators. I mean, that's,
okay, fine. So, in other words, maybe 10 years from now, the Democrats will be resurgent. But right 2 years from now, or a year from now, when the Democrats are nominating the next president, they're going to nominate somebody who supported the Bush amnesty program, supports bilingual education, opposes taking away citizenship from felons, supports people voting in foreign elections. I mean, a long, long list of issues that are an affront to the sovereignty thoughts of the American people, that are thoroughly in keeping with the ACLU and the left. And the American people will get to choose. Who do they want running the country? Somebody who's in tune with the ACLU and the left, or somebody who's in tune with American sovereignty. And I'm frankly feeling pretty good about that election coming up.
Well, if I mean, I don't see the. I mean, first of all, Webb easily could be the Democratic vice presidential candidate. I mean, I think the only strike against him there would be having two senators, and that he's a little bit of an unpredictable character. But I don't think there's a. I mean, there's an enormous fascination with characters like Webb and Tester and Brian Schweitzer and some of these folks who do well in conservative environments. So I don't think they're totally shut out, and then the Republicans have to actually capture that, have a voice that can capture that, which might be Gingrich. It's not Thompson. I mean, those are.
Well, who knows? I mean, if the Democrats put one of those freshman red state senators on the ticket, then I will stand corrected. My sense is that's not where they're leaning, and that they'll get vetoed. But if pragmatic Democrats who want to win, and you win by basically giving the American people what they want, as opposed to what you think they should have, then prospects for the Republicans are all of a sudden pretty gloomy. But I think that the reality is, at the same time, is that for the Democrats to get that vote, they will have to keep Webb and Tester and McCaskill and whoever else from the usual pattern, which is that you get elected as a conservative, like, say, Richard Gephardt, and then you become a liberal under pressure from the Beltway ideological groups.
Right.
And so if for example, the DNC and the hierarchs of here in this town convince Webb and Tester and McCaskill that they have a benighted retrograde position on immigration, and that they should see the light and hang out with George Soros, then obviously they've lost that opportunity.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a couple things to say about that. One is that you write out the possibility, and this is the banal mainstream press way of writing the story, but you write out the possibility that there's any sense that immigration is in fact a set of problems that there has to be some honest attempt to solve, even if you conclude that this wasn't the right way to do it. I mean, there are these people, there are a set of people here, either you give them a path to citizenship or you don't. We're not sending them all home. Right? I mean, it's a problem that has to be solved.
First of all, the answer the American people want is a wall. The American people did not support the immigration bill, which is why it failed, even though it had the overwhelming support of the inside the Beltway, both Democrats and Republicans. And remember, Mark, much of what I'm talking about here is and this is why the Panama Canal Treaty issue is so resonant in my mind, and I guess yours too, is this is really an insurgency within the Republican Party.
Right.
This is back to Samuel Lubell, the Sun Party and the Moon Party.
Yeah.
And if the Republicans for the last 25 years have been the Sun Party, which is say the dominant party, then the real news here is that the Sun Party is going through a convulsion, throwing off the kind of invade the world and bite the world ideology that George Bush tried to saddle them with. It didn't work in Iraq, and it's not working in the immigration bill. And so the clarifying new position is, for lack of a better word, nationalism. And of course, there's no reason why the Democrats can't be nationalistic too, except they just tend, in a John Kerry sense, to kind of be above that, which is to say they fall below the threshold of the voters.
Well, certainly of the Republican base. I mean, to generalize that broadly about the American people there's a base that can be activated on an issue like immigration. That's a very
Mark,
significant
where are the Reagan
part.
Democrats on issues of national sovereignty? The Reagan Democrats.
The Reagan Democrats are dead. The Reagan Democrats are 80 years old. Their kids approach things in a different way.
Well, the Reagan cubicle people then.
The Reagan office park debt. First of all, I mean, the immigration issue, you can't keep an issue alive once you've killed it.
Actually, the issue is going to continue because look. Now we can move to another issue, another topic, which is extremely related, and my column for Tuesday covers this, and that is you can't talk about immigration without also talking about homeland security and counterterrorism. Who lives in this country? Who lives in Britain? This all of a sudden people really, really care. There are 1.6 million Muslims in Britain, some of whom appear to have enormous, murderous, homicidal sympathy for the people who blew up the tubes 2 years ago in London, and the people who tried to blow up London again a couple days ago, and the people who tried to blow up Glasgow. Yes. Now, that's 1.6 million Muslims there. Now, there are somewhere between 5 and 8 million, depending on who you believe, Muslims in America. And the issue of how they got here and whether they're going to continue to come here and whether or not, for example, the University of Michigan, to talk about a swing state, is going to provide Muslim Islamic foot washing stations for Islamic students when they would never consider doing anything for Christians or Jews. Those are the sorts of issues that go right to the heart of how we organize our society and how we defend ourselves as a nation.
Well, that's easy to say as a set of slogans, but the fact is, of those 5 to 8 million, like almost, the most infinitesimal percentage have been involved in anything approaching terrorism, just as an infinitesimal percentage of native-born, Protestant whites are Timothy McVeigh or Nichols.
Well, I don't think the percentage is
it's not
infinitesimal. I don't think it's infinitesimal. I mean, according to the Pew Center, something like 26% of Muslims in America said they sympathize with suicide bombing as a tactic. 26%. And if you do the math, that's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. That's not infinitesimal.
And yet, for some reason, none of them actually do it.
Well, I mean,
they say what they say, but they are not. In fact, that doesn't make them a threat.
We keep uncovering plots, like the plot to however real it was, the plot to blow up John F. Kennedy Airport just a few weeks ago. In other words, I think this goes to the heart of all these issues. And for you, Mark. And for all the blogging heads, TV people out there, let me just share what I think is going on, and that is that the huge overhang on the immigration issue, and the reason why it's 1,000 times more important than the issue of whether or not some busboy gets a path to citizenship, is because it's wrapped up in these larger issues of multiculturalism, national identity, and, dare I say, national survival. When the British found themselves in World War II, when they were at war with Germany and Italy, they simply went through the entire German and Italian community in Britain, about 75,000 people, and interviewed them all, and said, "Now, are you loyal to Britain?" And about 28,000 of those people, we're talking about like in the years 1939, 1940, about 28,000 flunked that loyalty test. And so Winston Churchill, who was a popular figure both in Britain and in America, locked them all up. That's what you do when you're feeling threatened by war and destruction. You lock people up.
Well, we did the same here with Japanese, and only Michelle Malkin thinks that's an episode in our history we should be proud of.
But the difference was that Franklin Roosevelt just locked everybody up, and that was a mistake. But the idea of interviewing each of them individually is, in fact, I think, a pretty good idea. And if that's what it comes to make Britain and America, and I don't think that the politics of one country can be separated from the other. I think that we in Britain are so close by history, language, culture, and so on, that if they have a major move in their country, we will have a major move in our country. They pretty much go together across history. And the major move you're seeing is toward a real crackdown on immigration and multiculturalism, and you're going to see it here too.
Okay. Well, I mean, Britain has always been a country with less respect for civil liberties than our own. That is a choice, and it's a part of our national identity. Partly it's related to their, they've been battling terrorism in certain ways for a very long time. Partly they actually are not founded on the tradition of freedom in the way that this country is.
And
they
so
have a different national identity than. And what's the point of a national identity?
Freedom here, but let's also realize, and again, this is just, I think, just demonstrable, that the politics of these issues are now freighted with much more than the question of H-1B visas.
I agree that it's possible to link those things together, but I also think, the real experience of immigration that people have is not, in fact, of Muslims. I mean, there are 2 or 3 heavy Muslim communities in the United States. I lived in one of them in Brooklyn. For the most part, it's Spanish speaking, and I think the big reason that drives the politics is because there's a heavier Latino population in areas that it never existed before.
Well,
so that you have a backlash in Georgia or something like
right.
that, where there's a reaction to, oh my gosh, there's kids in my kids' first grade class who don't speak English, and that's news in some areas. It's not, to a lot of us it's not new, but in a lot of parts of the country it is. And I
just got an email from a friend of mine in Denver who said, that his wife had gotten a speeding ticket, and that she went to court, and the judge said, okay, now because our translators go home at 4 o'clock, all you English speakers have to wait in court until we process the Spanish speakers out. And then of course, all these Spanish speakers are there, and with their translators, and they say, listen, so-and-so here got busted, didn't have a driver's license, didn't have insurance, didn't have car registration, and the judge was giving them all $35 fines, which of course they couldn't pay because they didn't have $35, and so the judge said, well,
give them $35,000 fines then.
Let me finish. I'm explaining to you why the politics of this are so important.
Right.
Okay, so then my friend's wife gets up, and of course she gets a $249 fine, which she has to pay right then and there. And I will tell you that this email rocketed around America and is going to change the way, Governor Ritter and Senator Salazar and Senator Allard and everybody else in Colorado think about the immigration issue as it applies to the ongoing and unwanted multiculturalization of Denver, Colorado.
Well, what's your answer here? What's your answer to that?
Well,
there shouldn't be translators?
I think the first answer is a wall. No more. Draw the line.
Okay.
That's it. No more. Second answer is you begin a profound process of anglifying or anglicizing the official proceedings of this country. No bilingual education, no bilingual voting. And then you also say, listen, we'll provide translators, but we're going to pretty quickly phase them out because you're simply not going to be able to exist in this country if you don't speak English. You're not going to be able to get a driver's license. You're not going to be able to vote. You're not going to be able to do all those things. And this will do for 21st century immigrants and 21st century minorities what was done for 19th century minorities and 20th century minorities, which is they got to come to America and they got to join this wonderful country of ours. And they did so as Teddy Roosevelt, who was arguably the most progressive president this country's ever seen, said you do it by making everybody an American and nothing more.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're still. It doesn't bother me that there are large. People in this country speak different languages, and people come here. People come here in their 80s, who aren't necessarily going to learn English. People's parents come over, whatever.
Well, I think, Mark, this is what we have elections for. It might not bother you. It does bother me. And I'm telling you, that these issues in terms of now it's possible the Republicans will run John McCain, who is with Bush and Teddy Kennedy on this issue, and he'll be talking about the usual multicultural open borders crapola, in which case the Republicans will get blown away in 2008, and then the Republican Party will reformat itself, I predict, along these lines, and come storming back in the 2010 midterms just in time to take out the Democratic Congress, which passed a national health insurance plan without controlling the border. Because the one lesson of the welfare state is you can't have a welfare state with open borders.
Who's the Republican candidate who's not? I mean, Giuliani's in the same boat. Romney's not quite plausible on this. I mean, who's the...
Giuliani has a great deal of the kind of the New York Ellis Island mythos in him. And if he has that, he won't get nominated. And if he changes, then he'll change. And as for the rest of them, I think they're all solid on this issue. And again, I would just say there's no law that says the Democrats can't say, well, of course we're going to have a comprehensive welfare state. And of course we're going to have national health insurance and a higher minimum wage. And of course we're going to have solidarity and more labor unions. And the key to that is to purge the kind of multicultural transnationalism that has wrecked the Democratic Party since George McGovern.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we live in a more... I mean, part of that multicultural transnationalism has resulted in a more multicultural society.
And I don't think that's what the American people want.
Well, the American people are that multicultural society.
No, I think the American people are remarkably English-speaking and American culture-oriented. I think they're remarkably hostile to bilingual education, for example.
Well, I mean, some communities are, some communities aren't. I mean, my mother and uncle, came here from Germany, and they are sort of hostile to bilingual education. They hold that idea of, you come here, you learn English. But they also don't necessarily see it as a matter of law. And more, people are intermarried with Asian Americans, with Filipino Americans, with there's far greater African American intermarriage than, I mean, that's not really relevant to the immigration issue, but far more greater intermarriage with Latinos and so forth. I mean, multiculturalism is a reality. Well, it's not like a silly idea that liberals put up against this lily white America.
Actually, Mark, I was very careful to say multicultural. Let's not mix it up with multi-ethnic. Obviously, America, since the founding of this country, with Native Americans, who survived, and of course blacks, has been multi-ethnic all along. It has not been multicultural. Multicultural is Lebanon. Multicultural is Yugoslavia. Multicultural is the former Soviet Union. That's Austria-Hungary. That's multicultural. Multi-ethnic and unicultural has been the American ideal. And again, I will provide for the Blogging Heads viewers links to Teddy Roosevelt's speeches on exactly this topic all through the 1900s and 19-teens, because he was obsessed with this subject, because he understood you just couldn't have a viable America unless you made it one nation, to coin a phrase.
Right, and the quest of liberalism is to be able to create one nation, even as people have different different basic backgrounds and different orientations and different ways of seeing the world.
That's known as e pluribus unum. But the point is, the left, I won't say anything bad about liberals, but the left has forgotten the unum part. They're all into the pluribus, but not the unum.
Right, but there are people. I mean, Barack Obama's language is 100% e pluribus unum. Right, he does not forget the unum.
Which is why it's a shame of Obama, who I like a lot. And I do think he represents in many ways the best of this kind of national fusion of ethnicities and cultures and everything else in his own physical person. That's why it's a shame that he voted to keep the border open. He voted with Bush and Teddy Kennedy, a vote that will haunt him badly in 2008, even if it was necessary to help get the Democratic nomination.
Okay. Well, we'll see. I think there are a lot of downsides to a politics that gets reduced to, if Republican politics gets reduced to push the terrorism button as hard as you possibly can and as loud as you possibly can, and push on immigration in a way that sounds an awful lot like it's kind of the politics of hate. I think that put that up against a sort of broadly unifying vision, and I think there's an exhaustion to that Republican message,
well,
especially
that's what they all said about. That's what Tim O'Neill said when he said that Gerald Ford was the last Republican president. He said there's an exhaustion to this. So who wants to be a conservative anymore? Well, my point is conservatism is a never-ending font of power to people because it's basically what people live in their own personal lives, and they kind of want to see it applied to the country. And those who, especially, Mark, at a time, this is what's so inexplicable to me, at a time when we're seeing what's going on in Britain, and if we can't see that coming here next, we're fools, I think.
But what's going on? I mean, it's like occasionally people try to do something, and
Occasionally
most of the
people
time they
come here
botch
from
it.
another country with the intention of murdering the people who welcomed them in. If the reports about who these people are, who tried to blow up Glasgow and so on and so on and so on. I mean, I'll just remind you that it does not the exact thing I'm talking about here, which is an insurgency within the right parties, is what just happened in France, where Chirac was exactly the epitome of a tired, exhausted, burned out, enfeebled conservative movement that spoke in platitudes and generalities. Sarkozy comes along, young, relatively young, energetic, hard-nosed, no-nonsense, has an issue handed to him, which is the internal security riots in the Banlieues 2 years ago issue. Gets incredibly tough about it, much nastier in terms of calling the Algerian, North African population the French word for scum, which I don't approve of. I think that's kind of nasty. And he wins pretty thumpingly against exactly what liberals love, or the left loves, which is a female who doesn't marry the father of her children, who wears miniskirts and is all cool and pretty and dynamic.
I loved her.
Like
Yeah.
And she gets clobbered.
Yes. No, and I think Newt Gingrich's memo, which I guess he's turned into an op-ed and various things of the French model, is actually very persuasive. If you could find, I mean, Sarkozy had more to him than that too. He also had he had a solid economic plan. A Thatcherite but solid economic plan. I mean, he had a lot of dimensions to his policy that were not just French nationalism. And France is not the United States.
I agree, and I think that Republicans have to do that too, which is, and they may or may not. I think that implicit in, if you start talking seriously about the social contract, and frankly, my experience here at the New America Foundation, which is where half the people in this building sit around talking about the social contract all day, has made an impression on me. And it doesn't matter what I think. It matters that Republican governors like Arnold Schwarzenegger, admittedly, not the ace Republican of all time, and Mitt Romney, although he might not want to admit it now, both passed health care plans, Mark, I think you would agree, are kind of similar to what the New America Foundation has been pushing for years.
That's true. No, and I think there's but Romney can't even admit it. He can't even talk about it.
It's strange. But the nice thing about Romney is, since we know he's flexible, we know he'll flex back if he gets elected president to supporting some health care.
The nice thing about him is he'll say whatever the hell seems to be the right thing to say at any given moment, which is a problem. Who do you think survives from that? I mean, this isn't really on our topic list, but I mean, I'm still befuddled by this, by the sense that Republicans have to nominate somebody, but it's really hard. McCain is now really fading. Giuliani's numbers are going down. Romney seems to be holding steady, but there seems to be a lot more actual hostility to Romney.
Yeah, I think McCain is done for, and I think the immigration bill was the last nail in his coffin. I think that Giuliani, frankly, if there's ever a bunch of issues that he should have been all over, it was precisely the linkage between immigration and homeland security and the larger issues that affect American sovereignty.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, maybe he's too busy, patching things up with his ex-wives and ex-wives and stuff, he couldn't put it together politically. Right. And so he went from being an enormous lead, 3 months ago, it's like 45% of the Republican vote. He's down to like 25 now. Yeah. And I don't necessarily see him correcting himself. Obviously, Romney, it helps to have a couple $100 million to pitch into your campaign if you need to. Right. Has a way of staying in there. Thompson, is coming along strong, and I think he's got a much better read on these issues than most of the Beltway has had. And then I have to say that I also think that there's another name or two to emerge, such as maybe Gingrich, who is always the smartest and most concise and forceful articulator of just about anything you can think of, whatever you may think of him on other reasons. And I think that the field is still open to somebody like him jumping in, just to answer your question. But we should talk about the Democrats too, Mark. Yeah,
let's talk about the Democrats. And since we're talking about money, before we do, let's talk about something that you and I actually agree on, just to sort of like have a little sorbet in the in between courses here, which was the Supreme Court's ruling on issue advertising last week.
Go ahead. Because I agree with you. State your argument.
Yeah, I've been very involved in campaign finance reform, looking for ways to do it. And even back when they were first writing McCain-Feingold, and I was sort of on the margins of those circles, I would say, they would say, well, to make it work, what we have to do is we have to regulate these ads because look at these ads that you see that say, call your congressman and ask him why he's always raising taxes. And we have to basically, I don't want to say ban those ads. We have to make sure they're used, that hard money is used to pay for them. And I would say, well, that's great, but what are you going to do when the case comes along where they really do mean call your congressman? I mean, a lot of things come up late in they come up close to the election, and that right to sort of speak out on issues, that's the most fundamentally protected political speech. And, there was all this research commission that said, well, 98% of these ads really, they pretty obviously just mean vote against the person. But, I mean, this case in Wisconsin where it was, Wisconsin Right to Life, the ad said, call Senator Feingold and Senator Cole and ask them not to filibuster Bush's conservative judges. The Wisconsin Right to Life also opposed Senator Feingold, but they also had a view about the judges. I mean, there's no question about it. And the idea that you can neatly separate what's, election speech from what's issue speech in some way always seemed to be ridiculous. So this seemed like this actually is an easy case. And I think once you understand that you really can't limit that kind of speech, and there's no simple formula for doing it, the whole infrastructure of campaign finance reform that's based on limits, block this loophole, block that loophole, until you get it all under control, is just a dead letter. So that the only thing you can do is something that actually just sort of injects some money in the speech and encourages small donors. And just sort of makes it easier to be heard, because you're not gonna block out every other thing.
And so who are the Supreme Court judges who agreed with you on this?
Well, it was the conservative Supreme Court judges. I mean, it was one of the 5-4 decisions. But the 4 in the minority, I mean, their argument was on stare decisis grounds. Which was this was decided in McConnell. Right. And it was decided in McConnell, and you don't lightly decide you were wrong. But I think they were probably pretty obviously wrong. I mean, it was the great big surprise of the McConnell decision that they did let that provision go through, and it was because there was a lot of research put up there. It was a very strong factual record, but it's a kind of factual record. You do have to decide: does one case of does 1% overbreadth bring down the law or not? There's no hard and fast rule about that. I mean, to me, what's more interesting is just to say, okay, this era of campaign finance reform is now done. If we want to do something about moderating the influence of money in politics, making politics more competitive, making it easier to be heard, things like that, we need a whole different approach to it. And what's interesting is you see somebody like Obama's 258,000 donors. That tells you there's something happening that is there are things happening that are encouraging small donors to participate. And if you actually can raise money from a large number of small donors, it's a lot less corrupting than the politics of, the Lincoln bedroom, where there are no, of that 1996 scandal, where there are no small donors, and the only way, if you're Clinton, or if you're some senator, or if you're Tony Coelho or whatever, the only way you're going to raise money is by going to a handful of, basically, corporations or rich individuals and getting $500,000 out of each of them through some subterfuge. I mean, small donors really take a lot of the a lot of the corruption.
I agree with every word you just said.
All right, well, good. Okay, so that's
one point. That is, it'd be fun to say that this was that you've come around to the conservative position because you find yourself agreeing with John Roberts and Alito and Clarence Thomas and Anthony Kennedy and whoever I'm leaving out of the five. But I would also just point out to you that this McCain-Feingold, not unlike the immigration bill, was one of those issues of elite consensus. I mean, McCain, after all, is a Republican. Feingold is a Democrat. That's bipartisan. In the House, it was, as I recall, Shays Meehan, and Shays, of course, is a Republican, and Meehan is a Democrat. And so what you saw in the McCain-Feingold legislation, I guess 2002, I guess it was that the elite consensus gets together and say, listen, we kind of like the way things operate here inside the Beltway between us. We'll divide the power and not worry very much about, if we can help it, we can insulate ourselves against this rabble out there. And I think you saw a lot of it on the immigration bill, including on the sort of the sidebar issue to the immigration bill of various elitists trying to bring back the equal time rule. And the fairness doctrine for talk radio, because it wasn't just Dianne Feinstein and Hillary Clinton and Barbara Boxer. It was also Trent Lott saying very specifically, "Gosh, these talk radio people are making my life miserable." And Senator Voinovich, who said that the voters were quote intimidating him unquote. Well, that's the goal. Frankly, you want a political class that lives in fear of the voters. That's actually good.
Right. I mean, there was a little bit of grassroots movement around campaign finance reform, and it is. I mean, a lot of people felt like they were dragged, kicking and screaming into voting for something that they actually didn't really want. I mean, it is a funny episode, that 2002 bill, and it's the only episode in which Bush was actually forced to sign something that he didn't want to sign. Now, maybe it's because they knew it was good for them in the end, but I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that was totally an elite consensus. But of course, David Broder, the voice of the elite, just basically endorsed the Supreme Court decision there. So we're all moving around in funny ways. And I'm not where I was on this issue.
So the elites follow the
5 years ago.
The elites follow the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court follows the elections, and the elites follow the Supreme Court. Got it. Okay, now we know.
Right. Or maybe not. But you want to talk more about the Democratic race, or you want to?
Tell me. You're following this more closely than I am.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's an interesting story. I mean, I think there's a little bit of an elite sense that Obama has lost a little bit of steam. That he either, people look at it different ways. They say either he should be making up some ground in the polls right now, or he should have a policy message that's as interesting as his basic speech message, I think people who had a good first, I used the analogy today and a thing of that, I think that some of us who follow this very closely are kind of like the people who were standing online to buy an iPhone last Friday, of whom there was a long line outside our office, by the way. I don't know if you saw that, Jim, because we have a Singular store right next door, or an AT&T store. So there are people who are lining up to buy the iPhone, and they've been paying attention to the iPhone for a year, and they read their gadget blogs and all that. In a week, they're going to find 16 things they're disappointed about. But there's a whole other set of people who don't pay a lot of attention, who over the next year or two will look at the iPhone and think, oh, that's pretty cool, and they might buy one or they might not, but they'll think it's pretty cool. There's in that super elite group, there's a sense of like, okay, we're ready now for our second impression of Obama, and there's a little bit of disappointment. Somebody called it the inspiration deficit in an email today. Although not that, a little bit, but over here on this other side, in terms of I think people who are getting their first impression of Obama, it's basically still rolling in. The dough is still rolling in, the enthusiasm is still rolling in, the audience at the speeches are huge, and so forth. But it's a very difficult transition he has to make now from being, all steam and energy and enthusiasm to 6 months of kind of grinding it out before you actually get anybody to vote, and you're not really even sure where those first elections are going to be. And I think that's a very hard move to make. It's kind of where you're the most vulnerable to a Hillary Clinton who, basically just knows all the rules of politics and is executing them, with enormous
I think
skill.
that's a good point about the elites may be tired of Obama, they feel underwhelmed and they're moved on or something. But just a couple points to me as somebody not really part of the Democratic Party's nominating process. I guess that's an understatement.
We would welcome.
Well, if I were involved, I'd say two things. First off, watching the debate last week at Howard University, and they asked Obama about AIDS, and he said, AIDS is like an infection, but like a lot of things infect the African American community. We're infected by lack of jobs and weak education system and weak healthcare system. It was a very thoughtful, reasonable, comprehensive, to use a phrase I don't often use, approach to the problem. Mm-hmm. And by contrast, and then it was okay in terms of reception. Hillary got up and said, if AIDS afflicted white women between the ages of 25 and 34, there'd be outrage. And she said it in her own kind of shrieking, shrill way. Now she got the big applause, and Tavis Smiley was the one who was praising her, not Obama, on Meet the Press on Sunday. I much more found Obama to be a reasonable, rational, non-demagogic voice on this, especially since when AIDS was, racing through the white community 25 years ago, it was white males between the age of, say, 25 and 34, and it was killing them off in huge numbers, and there was a huge reaction to it. But they're gay. It was. Right. I found Obama to be appealing and Hillary to be off-putting, and it makes me now see better why the Mason-Dixon poll says that 52% of the American people, that's more than half, said they wouldn't vote for her, which I think will be a troublesome concern for Democrats if they in fact nominate her. And I agree with where I think you were headed, which is that she isn't obviously the favorite for the nomination.
Right. I think, other polls lead to different results than the Mason-Dixon poll because other polls actually match her up against actual named Republicans, and she wins in certain circumstances. So there's some reason to take the Mason-Dixon results with a grain of salt. The big question about Hillary Clinton is always, is the support she has a floor or a ceiling? And that's true. That's a question within the Democratic primary electorate as well as in the general electorate. There's the theory of the Hillary Clinton supporters, of Mark Penn and so forth, is like as you get there's a lot of people out there who, as they get to know the real Hillary, they realize, oh, she's not so liberal, she's not so terrible, she's not crazy, she's not going to force our children into Scandinavian child care against their will. And so, their impression of her can only go up. And then the other theory is, that people who are done with Hillary are done with Hillary. And the test, of course, was, that she came into New York, and this is, you always have to give her credit for this. She came into New York State with exactly the same poll situation. 49% of people would not vote for her under any circumstances, and she wins with 54%.
I think she won bigger than that, as I recall, like 58, as I recall.
That was last time.
Last time, like 68. I think she recall she won like 58 in 2000.
Okay, well, it was definitely better. It was definitely she definitely outperformed what you thought she could do based on those kinds of generic polls of her in a state that she never lived in and all that stuff. So there's some support, I think, for that, for the impression that, for the idea that Hillary, your impression of Hillary improves as you get to know her. But I think within the Democratic electorate, I think there's a lot. There are people who've written her off from the left, as well as from the right. I think within the Democratic electorate, that's a whole different equation to sort of change people's impression of her. I mean, within the Democratic primary electorate, I mean, first of all, impressions of her are more strongly held than in the electorate as a whole. And the opposition comes from a different direction.
Which paints her badly, you know, from a left-wing perspective of Michael Moore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I actually never was in the school of thought that said that Hillary is going to put all of our children in mandatory Sweden-style kibbutzes or anything like that. I think her record as First Lady of Arkansas kind of shows you where she's really coming from with Walmart and, you know, the Rose Law Firm and so on.
Yeah.
And which is again why I found myself sort of gravitating towards the document that I'm sure the Obama campaign has now disavowed. The famous Hillary Clinton D-Punjab memo that was leaked a few weeks ago. I thought the stuff they said about her facilitating the outsourcing of jobs to India was kind of persuasive, you know, and that's a serious issue. And I'm kind of with Alan Blinder, the Democratic economist from the Clinton White House, who says, you know, if we don't do something about outsourcing, we're going to lose 40 million jobs in America. And I should hasten to say that I'm not aware of any of the leading Republicans who have a better answer than this than Hillary does. But I would say if you think outsourcing is a good thing, if you're with Tom Friedman and you know the Jim Glassman and the globalizers on the Democratic side and the Republican side, you got nothing to fear from Hillary.
Right. Well, I think the problem with that is that, you know, I mean, I think if Obama and, you know, and potentially still Edwards, I mean, if they actually had a better answer, if all you have is attack, and this even goes on the immigration thing, if all you have is attack material, you have attack material. If you actually have a better answer for the economic anxieties of people, I mean, yes, there are national identity anxieties, but there are also fundamental economic anxieties. If you have a good answer to that, that's great. I think the problem is, on the Democratic side, is we don't have a particularly good answer to those questions of outsourcing. You know, we do phony stuff like John Kerry talks about the Benedict Arnold companies, and, you know, he's pretending he's talking about outsourcing, but he wasn't. If you don't have a better answer, you're not really in that game. So that Obama's language, to me, Obama's language needs a little upgrade from, you know, his language has been, we can't stand in the way of globalization, we have to help protect people, we need more like earned income tax credit. So it's Tom Friedman plus earned income tax credit, which is, you know, fine. It needs one step further of understanding that we can actually take some control, you know, we can do more than just use tax credits to patch the holes, that we could take a little bit of control of our economic destiny. I think if you upgrade that language a little bit, he doesn't have to go fully into an economic populist rant. I think he'll really capture something, but I think that doing the opposition research and memo by itself doesn't do that.
We're ending on notes of agreement here. I agree completely. More free advice to the Obama campaign. That is, they should say what went wrong with America's economic infrastructure and our arsenal of democracy.
Right.
That we couldn't build a vehicle that could withstand an IED attack in Iraq. Now, to Obama's great credit, he opposed the Iraq war from the get-go, before it started. So did I, by the way, from my different perspective. But I certainly think, and I know you do, and I know every American does, that our servicemen and women should have the best possible equipment. And part of that comes from a president who was able intellectually to mobilize and a competent Secretary of Defense, which we clearly didn't have. For 6 years. But another part of it comes from just sort of I used the phrase arsenal of democracy earlier on purpose, because that was what Franklin Roosevelt said in another war we were fighting. He said, listen, obviously the sinews of industry and factories and manufacturing things and things made of metal are vital to this. We can't just outsource ourselves and use Google to solve every problem we have, and that includes the anxieties of blue-collar workers who are seeing their jobs go overseas. It also includes the anxieties of parents who see their kids going in under-equipped military formations to an uncertain fate in some foreign war. And I think Obama or anybody Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, any Republican who talked like that would have a heck of a message that I think you and I, Mark, would both say, well, now we're getting somewhere in terms of America's surviving as more than just a country full of hedge funds. Okay.
I agree with you about that. I agree with you. I mean, there are different ways of talking about the industrial infrastructure, and it could be related to climate change, and it could be related to other aspects of energy. But I mean, I think that's a great way of linking it to the most current concerns of how vulnerable we've made ourselves in many situations.
Mark, I've always liked you.
Jim? Likewise. Glad to have a chance to do this.
Till next time, Blogging Heads people, thank you for watching.
Okay, be well.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.